October 1943, northern France. A veil of fog blankets the shattered village of Saint-Aubin-sur-Marne. Roofs sag like tired shoulders, chimneys gape like wounds, and in the stillness only one building breathes. The old community bakery, its chimney drawing a faint gray thread into the mist. Inside, Etienne Morel moves with the steadiness of habit. A man in his 50s, tall once, now slightly stooped, with eyes that seem to look inward rather than out. His hands are coated in flour, rough and strong, but his touch is careful, almost tender. The dough beneath his palms yields softly, sighing as he folds it. The rhythm of his work fills the silence. Scrape, turn, press, a sound that once meant life. The room smells of yeast and smoke, the perfume of survival. On the walls hang his father's old tools, wooden paddles, scorched peels, iron hooks. Etienne works alone now. The laughter that once filled the space has long faded. His wife died the first winter of occupation, and his son, Luc, proud, impatient, alive, joined the resistance near Reims. The message came quietly, captured, executed. Since that day, Etienne has spoken little, to others or to himself. He bakes for those who remain, the widows, the farmers, the weary old men, and by command for the Germans who occupy the village. Each morning they come in gray uniforms, collecting loaves with mechanical politeness. They count, inspect, and leave vouchers on the counter. Etienne nods, smiles faintly, and watches them go. Their boots echo long after the door closes. Guilt lingers heavier than the flour in the air. Every loaf he sends to them feels like a betrayal of his son's memory, yet to refuse would doom the village. So he keeps baking, silent, invisible, safe. But safety has begun to taste bitter. At night, the sound of distant bombing rolls through the valley, a low thunder that stirs something restless in him. He steps outside the bakery, sometimes to listen, eyes lifted toward the invisible front, and imagines Luc among those fighting to push the darkness back. The fog presses close, the air cold against the skin, and the thought comes unbidden. Perhaps it isn't too late to do something. Days pass. The routine continues. Until one afternoon a convoy arrives. Trucks rumbling into the square, engines coughing, German voices sharp. From his window, Etienne watches them unload wooden crates into the bakery's rear storeroom. Ammunition, he realizes, they are turning his bakery into a supply point. The officer in charge notices him watching. Their eyes meet. No words, only the weight of understanding. The officer nods curtly, and the work goes on. When the last truck leaves, the village grows still again. Etienne stands in the doorway long after the sound fades, breathing the mingled scent of flour, smoke, and diesel. His pulse beats with the rhythm of the fire. That night, under the weak light of an oil lamp, he pulls an old tin box from beneath the flour sacks. Inside lies a small jar of gray powder. Potassium, a relic from his father's experiments to quicken fermentation. He remembers the way his father had laughed when a pinch tossed into the flame made it flare blue and bright. Magic, the old man had said, science in the hands of bakers. Etienne stares at the powder, at the oven glowing faintly through the dark, and feels something inside him settle. Not anger, not courage, just decision. If he must feed the enemy, he will choose how. At dawn, the fog returns thicker than before. The soldiers come for their morning ration and find everything as always. The same quiet man, the same smell of warm bread, the same polite nod. They never see the flicker in his eyes, the small tremor in his hand as he loads the baskets. No one knows that beneath the crust of those loaves lies something unseen. The beginning of a plan shaped in silence, baked in fire, and born from love too deep to name. Outside, the church bell, cracked by shellfire, tolls once and falls quiet. The mist curls through the streets like breath. And for the first time in years, Etienne Morel feels his heart beat with purpose. Slow, steady, rising with the heat of the oven. The fog thickened again the next morning, turning the world to shades of gray. From the square, the bakery looked like a lantern wrapped in mist. Faint light trembling through its windows, the smell of wood fire mixing with the cold. Etienne Morel worked alone, as always, but there was something different in his movements now. Precision sharpened by purpose. Every gesture carried thought, every grain of flour a secret. On the wooden bench lay a small pile of delicate paper capsules, each one sealed with care, filled with a fine gray powder he had tested through the night. They looked harmless, like bits of dust caught in sunlight. He moved with the patience of a craftsman. Each capsule disappeared into a fold of dough, hidden deep in the crust, impossible to detect once baked. Too little to explode, too subtle to notice, but just enough to poison the fire that fed the German machine. Etienne's hand shook once, then steadied. "This is for you, Luke," he thought. From outside came the rhythm of boots. German voices barked orders in the square. Etienne's heart lurched, then slowed again to the measured pulse of his work. By dawn, the loaves stood ready on the rack, perfect, golden, innocent. When Sergeant Kruger entered to collect the day's ration, Etienne greeted him with his usual calm. The officer sniffed a loaf, nodded, and muttered, "Good bread. The men will be pleased." Etienne smiled faintly. "Bread always helps," he said. No one saw the flicker in his eyes as the soldiers carried the baskets away. By evening, whispers began to drift through the village. Soldiers coughing, pale and feverish. A few taken away in trucks. Bad water. The German said, "Bad air." Etienne kept his face blank, but inside his chest something beat fast and bright. Not joy, not revenge, but relief. It had worked. That night, sleep refused to come. He sat by the dying fire, the glow painting his face in shades of amber and shadow. In the flickering light, he saw Luke again, not the boy who had died, but the young man he might have become. "You did something, Papa," that ghostly voice whispered. Etienne closed his eyes and let a single tear fall into the ashes. The next morning, the camp near the forest stood eerily quiet. A cart creaked past, loaded with supplies. The driver crossed himself. Etienne watched from his doorway, heart steady, knowing this could not last forever. Sooner or later, suspicion would find him, and it came sooner than he hoped. A few days later, a young German officer stopped by the bakery. Not the gruff sergeant, but another man, younger, fair-haired, his uniform spotless. His name tag read Lieutenant Fisher. "You bake well, monsieur," Fisher said in careful French, holding a loaf. "My mother was a baker in Lubeck." Etienne nodded. "Then you know that bread keeps people alive." The officer smiled faintly. "When it is not poisoned," he said softly. Etienne froze, the sound of fire suddenly too loud. He forced a chuckle. "A joke." "Perhaps," Fisher said, studying him. "Strange things happen in war." He placed the loaf back gently and left. The door closed. Etienne stood still for a long time, the smell of smoke and yeast stick around him. Fisher's tone hadn't been threatening, almost kind, but kindness could be dangerous. It meant attention. That night, Etienne hid the tin of powder beneath the floorboards. The village could not pay for his defiance. If the Germans discovered what he had done, they would burn everything. He decided that tomorrow's batch would be the last. Outside, rain began to fall. Thin, cold, relentless. It hissed on the chimney, on the cobblestones, on the leaves of the square's lone tree. In the distance, artillery rumbled like a slow heartbeat. The war was moving closer. Etienne stood at the window, looking out at the rain. The street lamps glowed faintly through the fog. For the first time in years, he felt no guilt, no hesitation, only peace. He had done what he could. His son might rest easier now. He turned back to the fire, adding one last log. The flame caught, rising with a sigh. Tomorrow, he thought, would bring whatever it must. The next morning broke gray and soundless. The fog was thicker than ever, pressing close to the windows, swallowing the shapes of roofs and trees. Etienne worked by the light of the oven alone. The fire glowed like a secret heartbeat behind him. The door burst open without warning. Lieutenant Fisher stood in the threshold, coat wet from mist, 2 soldiers behind him. His voice was quiet, almost regretful. "Guten Morgen, Monsieur Morel. We need to talk." Etienne didn't stop kneading. "If it's about bread, I have plenty." Fisher stepped closer. "It's about what's inside it." He placed a small object on the table, a grain of gray dust sealed in wax paper. "I found this in a loaf meant for the officers." Silence filled the room. The only sound was a low roar of the oven. Etienne looked at the speck as if it belonged to another world. Flour impurity, he said evenly. It burns, Fisher replied. Like powder. Their eyes met. The young officer's expression was not cruel. It carried confusion, even sympathy. Why, Monsieur Morel? You're not a soldier. No, Etienne said. I'm a father. Fisher's jaw tightened. Your son, Luc Morel, he fought with the resistance, didn't he? Etienne's hands trembled, then steadied again. He believed in something. And you believe this will bring him back? Fisher's tone softened, almost pleading. Etienne met his gaze. No, but maybe it will make his death mean something. For a long moment, neither moved. The fire filled the silence between them. Finally, Fisher exhaled and said, Stop, please. I'll pretend I found nothing. But if anyone else discovers this, the village dies with you. Etienne nodded slowly. Then I suppose I have one day left. Fisher hesitated, then turned and left, his boots fading into the fog. Etienne stood alone, the echo of the warning still in the air. He looked toward the oven, its mouth glowing red. The fire seemed to breathe faster, hungrier. He could feel the heat on his face like the pulse of something alive. That evening, the village felt restless. German patrols doubled. The sound of engines filled the square. Whispers of investigation moved through the walls. Old Margot came to him at dusk, her hands shaking. They're searching houses, she said. Someone talked. Etienne thanked her quietly, then closed the door and barred it. The decision had already been made. He began to prepare his final batch. He worked through the night, faster than ever, guided by instinct more than thought. He mixed the last of the powder, folded it into the dough, packed the furnace with wood until it roared like a storm. Sweat dripped from his forehead. The air shimmered. The fire's heat licked the walls, bright enough to blur the edges of the room. Outside, boots echoed on cobblestones, close, urgent. Voices shouted orders. Etienne barely heard them. His hands moved with calm purpose, sliding trays into the oven, sealing the door. The latch clicked shut. When the door burst open again, Fisher was the first through. Etienne, he shouted. The heat struck him like a wave. The baker turned, eyes calm, face glistening with sweat. Go, Etienne said softly. There's nothing left to take. Fisher saw the truth in the man's eyes. He turned to his soldiers. Out, now. They stumbled back into the street as a low rumble began within the walls, a sound deep and slow, like the earth taking a breath. Fisher ran, shouting for everyone to clear the square. Then light, a single, blinding bloom of white. When the glare faded, the bakery was gone. In its place lay a hollow of fire and smoke, the air heavy with the smell of scorched wood and something faintly sweet. Bread, burning. Fisher rose from the ground, his uniform gray with ash. The village was in chaos, yet no one spoke. Through the haze, he saw the villagers staring at the ruins, not screaming, not weeping, only standing still. He stepped forward until he reached what was left of the oven. Its stones glowed red, cracking as they cooled. On the ground lay a fragment of cloth, half-burned, marked with the initials EM. Fisher knelt and touched it gently. You fool, he whispered, voice breaking. You brave, stubborn fool. Overhead, the sky pulsed with distant flashes, Allied bombs on the horizon. The sound of war moved on, leaving St. Aubin in silence. By dawn, the fire had died. Smoke curled upward in thin white threads. The villagers gathered around the ashes. Someone said softly, "The baker is gone." Another replied, "No, he's still here." And as the morning light spread to fog, the air filled once more with a faint smell of bread, impossible, comforting, alive. When dawn finally came, St. Aubin-sur-Marne looked as if time itself had stopped breathing. The fog lingered over the ruins like a veil. Where the bakery had once stood, only a blackened shell remained, walls fractured, stones still hot to the touch. Smoke coiled into the cold morning air, curling above the rooftops like a final prayer. No one spoke at first. The villagers gathered slowly, faces pale, eyes hollow from disbelief. Someone crossed themselves. Someone else whispered, "He did it." But no one dared say his name too loudly. Fisher stood apart, his uniform streaked with soot, his expression unreadable. He had survived the blast with little more than bruises, but something inside him had burned away. He watched the villagers as they approached the ruins, not with hatred, but with reverence. They did not see treachery. They saw deliverance. The explosion had destroyed the munitions store behind the bakery. The German supply convoy was crippled, their communication lines severed. Command was furious, but their anger dissolved into confusion. No one could understand how one small fire had undone so much. When interrogators came from Amiens, they questioned everyone. Fisher kept his story simple. "The munitions overheated," he said. "A fault, nothing more." The officers frowned, unconvinced. And the baker? Fisher's gaze didn't waver. "He died serving us breakfast." They recorded it without further comment. Days passed. The army began to pull back from the region, retreating toward the southern lines. Supply routes were collapsing everywhere. Allied planes circled distant skies, their thunder like a new heartbeat over France. St. Aubin was no longer a target. It was a scar. On the third evening after blast, Fisher returned alone to the ruins. The village was silent except for the creak of shutters and the distant rustle of leaves. He carried a lantern. The light flickered over the shattered stones, the blackened arch of the oven still standing like the frame of a memory. Kneeling, he brushed away the ash. Beneath it he found something small, a piece of ceramic, curved and soot-stained, the remnant of an oven door. Etched into it, faint but visible, were the marks of a hand. Etienne's, pressed there long ago when the clay was soft. Fisher traced the print with his fingertips. He spoke quietly, as if afraid to disturb the air. "You've done what soldiers couldn't," he said. "You stopped an army without a gun." He sat there for a long time, the lantern's glow trembling in the wind. When he finally stood, he looked toward the villagers, watching from a distance. Their faces reflected the same grief and gratitude he carried. No one would report this. No one would betray the secret. The old baker had become their silence, their protection. By the next morning, the German convoy was gone. The trucks rolled out to the fog, engines droning like exhausted beasts. From their windows, soldiers stared at the village without speaking. They left behind crates, broken tools, and the scent of smoke that would not fade. Fisher was the last to leave. Before stepping into his jeep, he turned once more toward the square. Margot, the widow who had known Etienne since childhood, stood beside the fountain holding a small basket. Inside it was a single loaf of blackened bread, salvaged from the ruins. She placed it gently on the stone ledge. Their eyes met across the empty square. She nodded once, not in forgiveness, but in farewell. Fisher hesitated, then approached. He broke the loaf in half and handed her one piece. "For him," he said quietly. "For all of us," she replied. He climbed into the jeep and drove away. The road curved into fog, swallowing the vehicle whole. By afternoon, the villagers returned to the square. One by one, they placed loaves beside Margot's, offerings in silence. No speeches, no songs. Just bread cooling in the cold air, the scent of smoke and yeast mingling like memory and prayer. When dusk came, they stood together watching the smoke drift toward the sky. The old church bell, cracked and silent for years, gave a single uncertain ring, a note caught between mourning and hope. That night, from the distant woods, the faint sound of artillery rolled across the fields. But this time it was different. It was the sound of retreat. And in the half-light between night and dawn, those who remained swore they could smell fresh bread again. Faint, impossible, floating through the ruins. Some said it was the oven still cooling. Others said it was Etienne, finishing his work. Whatever it was, they stood in silence and breathed it in. The war was not over yet, but in that small village, it already felt won. For days after blast, St. Aubin-sur-Marne smelled of smoke and rain. The fog never lifted. It clung to the rooftops like memory. Where Etienne's bakery once stood, a crater of warmth slowly cooled beneath the ashes. The villagers passed by in silence, as if afraid to disturb what remained of him. The Germans were gone. Their trucks had rolled south, leaving behind only muddy tire tracks and the echo of engines. The occupation had ended not with banners or gunfire, but with one man's fire. The villagers began to rebuild almost without speaking. Stones were cleared, glass replaced, the rhythm of hammers marking time. No one claimed leadership. They simply worked together. It was as if Etienne's calm had passed into them all. Each evening, Margot came to the square carrying a small basket of bread. She laid it beside the fountain, covered it with cloth, and whispered, "For him." Others followed her example. Soon the fountain became an altar of sorts, a mound of loaves, each one different, all made in silence. The smell of bread returned to St. Aubin, faint and bittersweet. Weeks later, Allied troops arrived, dusty, smiling, surprised to find a village already free. They saw the ruins, the villagers' faces, the loaves by the fountain, and understood something wordless had happened here. When an officer asked what had destroyed the depot, Margot simply said, "A baker who loved his son." The soldiers left them supplies and a flag, but the villagers did not raise it. Their freedom was not a thing to wave. It was something that rose from the earth itself, like heat from old stones. When spring came, the villagers rebuilt the bakery. They used the same foundation, the same bricks wherever they could. Inside, they placed a small wooden plaque above the new oven. For H.M. Morel, the fire fed us all. No one ever spoke of sabotage again. The secret became legend, the legend became truth, and truth softened into myth. Children born after the war would hear only that a baker once saved the village with his oven. None knew how. They didn't need to. By summer, St. Aubin had become peaceful again. Vines crept up the walls, bells rang for weddings, and fields rippled with wheat. But every morning, when the first bread came out of the new oven, the air filled with a warmth that made even strangers pause. "It smells like home," the soldiers had said. The villagers called it Le Parfum du Pardon, the scent of forgiveness. One evening, long after the bakery was rebuilt, Fisher returned. He came quietly, on foot, his uniform gone, his hair streaked with gray. He stood before the fountain at sunset, hat in hand. Margot saw him and said nothing. He knelt, placed a loaf on the stone, and whispered something only the wind heard. When he rose, tears lined his face. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. After that day, no one saw him again. Years passed. The world moved on. The war became stories in classrooms, names on plaques, medals in drawers. But the village kept its ritual. Each October, before dawn, they gathered in the square. No speeches, no priest. Just bread, warm, plain, honest, laid at the fountain, steam curling to the mist like ghosts returning home. And sometimes, when the air was cold enough, the oven's door would creak by itself, as if someone unseen were checking the crust. The fire inside would flicker a little brighter, just for a moment. People smiled when it happened. "The baker's awake," they'd say. "He's making sure we remember." Spring 1944 arrived quietly in northern France. The snow melted, the river stirred, and St. Aubin-sur-Marne began to breathe again. The fields turned green where tanks had once cut through the soil, and the air smelled of wet stone and wheat. The bakery's chimney smoked each morning once more. Margot now oversaw it, her hands slower, her hair silver, but her devotion unchanged. She baked in silence, repeating every motion she had once watched H.M. perform, folding the dough twice, pressing her fingers into the crust before sliding it into the fire. He taught me that, she would whisper, though he never really had. Each loaf that came from the oven felt like a message, one that said the world could heal. News spread slowly in those months. Allied forces advanced through Normandy. The war's tide was turning. One afternoon, a stranger arrived at the bakery, a man in a faded French uniform, his face thin from years in hiding. He bought a loaf, ate it slowly, then asked softly, "Is it true? A baker here destroyed a German depot last year." Margot hesitated. "Why do you ask?" He pulled a folded paper from his coat, a resistance report. At the bottom, in neat handwriting, was a single line: "St. Aubin-sur-Marne bakery explosion delayed German advance, October 1943. Civilian saboteur presumed dead. Local hero. The man smiled. Your baker helped more than you know. The delay he caused gave our fighters time to regroup. London knows his name. Margot's eyes filled. Then he wasn't forgotten. The man placed his cap to his chest. Not by us. He left before she could thank him, disappearing into the fog. That night, she sat by the oven long after the loaves were done, listening to the crackle of the fire. You see, she whispered into the smoke. They remember, and for a moment, she could almost hear Etienne's quiet voice. Good. Then bake for them too. Weeks later, Allied convoys arrived. Soldiers rolled to the village, tired but smiling, greeted not with cheers but with the smell of bread. The bakery became their refuge. A Canadian lieutenant wrote in his journal, "The air here smells like forgiveness. The villagers say the baker saved them with his fire. I believe it." By summer's end, St. Aubin was free. The villagers hung no flags. They only kept baking. When reporters passed through, they photographed the plaque above the oven. For H.M. Morel, the fire fed us all. The picture appeared in a small London paper under the headline, "The Baker Who Burned for Freedom." No one knew how much was true, but it didn't matter. The story had already become something larger than fact, a legend of hope born from hunger. Years later, historians would find the same report filed in Allied archives, stamped verified. But there was no photograph, no records of his family. Only that name and one short note, civilian baker, act of defiance, outcome decisive. The rest lived in the air, in the warmth of ovens, in the smell of morning, in the hands of those who kept his craft alive. By the war's end, St. Aubin had changed. The fields were whole again. The church bell was mended. Children grew up knowing only that a man once turned bread into freedom. And whenever fog rose from the river, they said it carried the smell of his baking, smoke and flour and memory, blending into something almost sacred. Margot lived long enough to see peace settle like dust on the village. Before her death, she left a note on the bakery wall. The fire must never go out. If it does, light it again. The villagers obeyed. Every morning before dawn, someone still lit the oven and whispered. For him, the flame caught, and the air filled once more with that smell, part bread, part ghost, part gratitude. And so, while armies marched across maps and cities fell to rubble, in one small village of France, the war's truest victory had already been won. A man with flour on his hands had proven that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply rises. Time passed quietly in St. Aubin-sur-Marne. The war faded into photographs and memories, yet the smell of bread still rose every morning like prayer. The villagers rebuilt, married, grew old, and taught their children the same story whispered through flour, dust, and fog, that once a baker had fed freedom itself. By 1948, the bakery was the center of life again. No one called it by a name. It was simply La Fournaise's, the furnace. Margot, now gray and frail, kept it running with slow, deliberate care. She still spoke to the oven each morning, just as Etienne once had. "Wake up, old friend," she'd say, striking the match. "He's watching." The bread carried a flavor no one could quite describe. Smoky, warm, with a faint sweetness that lingered like a memory you couldn't place. Travelers often remarked, "It tastes like something older than us." The villagers only smiled. "That's Etienne," they'd reply. In those years, France was rebuilding itself, craving stories of courage. Most came from generals, soldiers, politicians. But St. Aubin's hero was different. He had no medals, no grave, only a fire that refused to die. Children grew up calling him Le Boulanger Fantôme, the ghost baker. When fog rolled in thick from the river, mothers would say, "He's baking again. That's why it smells so good." Then, in 1948, a letter arrived from Paris. It bore the seal of the Republic. Inside was a note of recognition. The Republic of France acknowledges with gratitude the civilian baker of St. Aubin-sur-Marne, whose sacrifice delayed enemy forces and protected the lives of countless citizens. May his fire never be forgotten. Attached was a small bronze medal, Pour le courage silencieux, for silent courage. Margot wept as she read it. She placed the medal above the oven, beside Etienne's old photograph, and lit the fire beneath it. The bronze glowed softly in the heat. "You hear that?" she whispered. "They remember your name." After that, the bakery became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Travelers came not just for bread, but for the story. They left coins, flowers, sometimes even bits of paper with prayers written on them. No one called it superstition. It felt like gratitude. Margot grew older. Her hands stiffened, her breath shortened, but she never missed a morning. She baked until the last winter of her life. In 1952, on a day heavy with fog, she was found seated at the kitchen table, a loaf cooling beside her, hands dusted with flour. On the table, a note in her neat handwriting read, "Keep the fire warm. He'll come back when it's cold." They buried her beside Etienne's old foundation. On the gravestone, they carved both their names. Etienne Morel, 1888 to 1943. Margot Leclerc, 1891 to 1952. And below her words, "The fire fed us all. The bakery passed to her niece, then her niece's son, and each generation kept the same ritual. Before dawn, they lit the oven and whispered, 'For him, always.'" Even when no one remembered exactly why, they kept saying it. By the 1960s, when France had changed beyond recognition, travelers still found their way to the village. They said the bread there had a warmth that felt alive, something no recipe could teach. Some thought it was the wood, others the water. The villagers knew better. They said it was what happens when love survives fire. Every October, on the anniversary of the blast, the people of St. Aubin still gathered at the fountain before sunrise. No music, no speeches. Only bread laid in silence, steam curling upward like ghosts. Then, as the first light touched the rooftops, they went home, leaving the loaves behind for birds. That quiet ritual became the village's heartbeat, its promise to never forget. Sometimes, on those misty mornings, someone swore they saw him, a figure near the bakery's door, shoulders bent, apron tied, eyes calm. A trick of fog, perhaps, or maybe not. In St. Aubin, no one was frightened by it. They simply smiled and said, "The baker's checking his work again." Winter, 1973. 30 years after fire, the fog still rolled through St. Aubin-sur-Marne each morning, curling around the rooftops like an old friend. The world outside had changed. Paris electric with light, television screens humming. But here, time moved at the pace of bread rising. The bakery now belonged to Henri Morel, Etienne's great-nephew. He was a man much like his ancestor, quiet, steady, hands strong from years of kneading. Each morning before dawn, he lit the oven the same way Etienne once had, whispering the words passed down like a prayer. For him, always, even on the coldest mornings, when frost painted the windows and the river froze, the bakery never went cold. The fire seemed to keep itself alive. Henri often said he didn't light the flame. He merely woke it up. That winter was the harshest in years. Snow buried the village. Power lines failed. And the only warmth for miles came from the bakery. Each morning, people gathered in the square. Farmers, widows, workers, waiting for the smell of bread that meant morning had survived the night. Henri gave out loaves freely, saying only he would have done the same. One afternoon, while cleaning the cellar beneath the oven, Henri found something strange behind a loose stone, a rusted tin box. Inside, wrapped in oil paper, lay a small iron scoop and a folded sheet of brown parchment. The words, faded but clear, read, "If this survives me, know that I was afraid, not of dying, but of doing nothing. Let the fire speak louder than I ever could." Etienne Morel. Henri read again and again, the ink trembling in his hands. He carried the letter upstairs and pinned it to the bakery wall beside the plaque. Then he stoked the fire higher until its glow filled the room like sunrise. That night, a snowstorm swallowed the village whole. The streets vanished under white silence. Yet through the storm, a warm light flickered from the bakery's window. Steady, alive. People came knocking through the cold, seeking warmth and bread. Henri welcomed them all, his face shining with sweat and peace. At midnight, he stepped outside for more wood. The air was still, the snow falling in slow, silver flakes. By the fountain, Through the haze of snow and light, he saw a figure, faint, blurred by the storm. A man stood there in an apron, hands behind his back, watching the bakery. Henri froze. The figure nodded once, calm, approving, and vanished into the wind. Inside, the oven flared brighter. The fire seemed almost joyful, its flames dancing like laughter. Henri whispered, "Thank you," and slid another loaf into the heat. By dawn, the storm was gone. The village woke to a world of white. But in the square where the snow lay untouched, a single line of footprints led from the fountain to the bakery door, and nowhere else. When people saw them, no one questioned. They only smiled. "The baker came back," Margot's granddaughter said softly. "He always does when it's cold." That spring, Henri rebuilt the old fountain. He placed a small carving above it, a loaf wrapped in flame, and beneath it, Etienne's words, "Let the fire speak louder than I ever could." The villagers gathered for the unveiling. No speeches, no flags, only silence, the sound of fountains, water, and the smell of bread drifting from the bakery. The moment felt sacred, as if the air itself remembered. Years turned to decades. Tourists came and went, drawn by the legend of the Forgotten Baker. Some called it myth, others miracle. But to those who lived there, it was simply truth. That warmth can outlast war, and courage can be baked into memory. Every morning, the same ritual endures. Before lighting the flame, the baker whispers into the silence, "For him." The match flares, the oven exhales, and the air fills with that unmistakable scent, with flour and forgiveness. And as the fog lifts over the fields, the village glows faintly gold, like a loaf just pulled from the fire, its crust crackling, its heart still beating with heat. Because courage, when made with love, never burns out. It rises again and again like bread,